Alright, I want to talk now about the rules of replacement. The rules of replacement are an interesting thing in that they're not so much about they're not about rules like the others are rules of inference, which is a process of logic, the idea of how these things infer something else. The rules of replacement really mean that these two statements are logically equivalent. If we were to take and do a truth table comparing these two statements, we would find that on every line that these statements have the same truth value. And that's what this for dot thing right here is basically saying, that these are logically equivalent. And so the first one is saying double negation. Then as far as from a truth table perspective, the letter P means the same thing as not P. That means the exact same thing. And you can actually change these on part of a line, which is sort of an interesting thing, because even within a statement, as long as you're not breaking up brackets or parentheses, you can actually do this on part of a line. But if you had just a letter in the middle, you could change it to a bar P, and that would be fine. But the idea is that, saying something like "I agree" is the same thing as saying I do not disagree. Those would mean the exact same thing. That the double negation is the same thing as just saying it straight out. Now the next one is what we call De Morgan's rule. I like De Morgan's rule, but a lot of times, a lot of people, like for example, on the first or on the last exam, not the last exam, but the exam for Module 6, where there were the translations, sometimes people would just move the bar inside parentheses. If they had, it's not the case, and they just put the bar inside. Well, the problem is it doesn't really work that way. The problem is if you have a bar, parentheses, P plus Q, as you do right here, that actually doesn't mean bar P plus bar Q. It means bar P wedge bar Q. Now, what does that mean? Well, if I said to you it's not the case that both Paul and Quentin will be there, am I saying Paul won't be there and Quentin won't be there? No, I said it's not the case that both Paul and Quentin won't be there, which is bar parentheses P plus Q. Instead, what I'm saying is it's not the case that Paul or not Quentin will be there. We know one of them won't be there. I don't know which one, but one of them won't be there. So if I say it's not the case that Paul and Quentin will be there, I'm really saying either Paul or Quentin will not be there. And that's what this second one is saying. And if we take something like neither Paul nor Quentin will be there, then I'm really saying that Paul won't be there and Quentin won't be there. And so I'm really saying this. And so one of the rules is that in order to move that bar inside the parentheses and eliminate the parentheses, you negate both of the conjuncts or disjuncts, but then you change the operator inside the parentheses to either a wedge if it's a plus or to a plus if it's a wedge. So you change the thing. Material implication, this is an example I gave in my initial video, which is basically this idea that if this then that is basically the same thing as saying either the antecedent is not true or the consequence true. And I use the example that I sometimes tell my kid, I'll sometimes tell my 2-year-old, I'll sometimes say, if you hit your brother, then you're going to get time out, or you're going to go to bed, or you're going to go to your room, or so, I don't know what. I mean, whatever the punishment might be, or you're not going to be allowed to play with that. And so, I mean, the punishments are within reason, given that he's a 2-year-old. But the case is that if you do this thing, then you won't get that. And then so I will say either you don't hit your brother or you're getting time out. And that's essentially taking the same thing. And you can think of this as either you study. If you study, then you'll pass. So you don't study or you'll pass. You can kind of switch that around. And most of us can kind of follow how that works. Now, the triple bar, the material equivalence, is basically just taking two statements, and it's just saying if P then Q and if Q then P. And so anytime you see that, you can move that triple bar in. It also is the same thing as saying parentheses P plus Q, close parentheses, plus wedge, bar P, bar wedge, plus bar Q, close parentheses. So it's either saying they're both true or they're both not true. But we aren't going to learn that rule, but that is another form of equivalence that we could also translate that with. Distribution is the idea that if you have something like P plus Q wedge R in parentheses, Q wedge R in parentheses, you can distribute that P into the parentheses by making it P plus Q wedge P plus R, because you know it's going to be the case that P is true and then it's either Q or R. The best example that we have in the book has it is, sometimes a restaurant, and this of course also uses it for the fact that where the comma is makes a big difference, but it says, sometimes will go to a restaurant and they'll say that will be served with French fries and either a salad or soup. So it means you're either getting French fries and salad or French fries and soup, and that's just moving it in. And the other time they'll say, it's served with either French fries or I'm sorry, it's served either with a pasta or it's served with a salad and potato or something like that. So it's the case you're either going to get P or Q and P or R. And so that's another way of moving it in. Basically what happens is this P wedge part, the part that's outside the parentheses, goes inside both sets of parentheses with the other letters, and then the operator inside the parentheses becomes the main operator over here. Commutation, I'm not even sure we'll really use this one. Some strict logicians would want you to use it. I'm not that strict about it, but essentially if you have a statement like P or Q, it means the same thing to say Q or P. If you say Paul or Quentin is coming, it's the same thing as saying Quentin or Paul is coming. If I say Paul and Quentin are coming, it's the same thing as saying Quentin and Paul are coming. You can switch the order of the names around. It means the same thing. Next one is association. Association, the key here is that if you have everything in this parenthesis, if everything is a wedge, like you have P wedge, parentheses, Q wedge, R, you can move the parentheses around sort of at will. You can make it P wedge, Q wedge, R. You can make it P wedge, R, wedge, Q. And same thing if they're all pluses. With pluses and wedges, you can do it. You can't do it with horseshoes. You can't do it with triple bars, but you can do it with wedges and pluses if they're all. Now, that's where you would use commutation or commutativity, isn't it? Commutation is in this where maybe you want to switch the Q and R around here, so it's maybe make it P wedge parentheses R wedge Q, and then you'd move it to P wedge R wedge Q, something like that. So you can sort of associate them differently. But essentially, as long as they're all wedges, they're all pluses, you can move them around. Transposition. Transposition is just a rule to switch the antecedent and consequent around. Essentially, with a modus tollens, you know that if the consequent is false, then the antecedent is false. So essentially, if you have an if-then statement, if you want to make it the other way, where the Q or the consequent is the antecedent, you would have to negate both sides when you switch it. The next one is exportation. Exportation is kind of an odd rule, and you probably don't use it very much. But it's basically if you have a statement like Paul and Quentin are there, then Randy will be there. That's the same thing as saying Paul is there. If Paul is there, then Quentin will be. Then it's the case that if Quentin is there, then Randy will be there. But if you have a P plus Q in parentheses up here, you can switch it over to that, or you can make both of these true. And this would probably be a case where, for example, one of the ones I've used before is like, with this, the second half is something like, if, like so-and-so, used to date, Cindy used to date Bill. Okay, so if Cindy flirts with Bill's friend, then Bill finds out, then Bill will be jealous, and so that would be this sort of first one, this P plus Q. If Cindy flirts and Bill finds out, then Bill will be upset or jealous. And then this one is saying, if Cindy flirts, then it's the case that if Bill finds out, then he will be jealous. And so you can kind of see as how both of those, at least intuitively, probably make sense to you. That, you would say, okay, that makes sense. If, you can change that to P and Q, or you can put that inside the parentheses. And finally, tautology, and this can go with wedge or plus. Anytime you have a double statement, P plus P or P wedge P, you can just simplify it out to P. Now with simplification, you could do the P plus P because you could simplify out either conjunct. But with a wedge, you couldn't really do it without knowing one of them wasn't true. But if they're both P wedge P, it's true. Like sometimes people will say something like, well, she's either going to be late or she's going to be late. They're basically just saying she's going to be late, and you can simplify that out via the rule of tautology. If it's true, the or statement, then you can know the leveled out is true. that the simplified out is true.